Yeah, because the last group is hanging. I think we're going to have to use all the seats, so if any seats available, you have to kind of switch over and make them available so that people can sit. All right, so this is.
You're starting.
Yeah. We're about a half an hour behind schedule for our activities this afternoon, and this is a sort of a liminal kind of activity, meaning semi-public, semi-internal, because following this we'll have our organizational meeting for the members of Platypus who have convened this weekend. Sort of a new tradition that we started last year, namely a president's report looking at the state of the left and how Platypus might approach the state of the left in this historical moment. And so the topic that I chose for this year, last year it was reconsideration of the 1970s phase of the New Left, which we'll finally be bringing to fruition in a public event in May. A panel on the 1970s New Left at the University of Chicago, and we've been publishing over the course of the year a series of articles, a couple of interviews with Max Albaum and Mel Rothenberg about that 70s moment. So what I'm hoping to do then with this talk is sort of provide some categories for us to be thinking about our work going into next year. So the topic for today is the anti-fascist versus anti-imperialist left, some genealogies and prospects.
Would you be okay if the microphone is on? It is a little hard to hear back here.
You can't hear me?
Yeah.
All right, let me see.
Do you know how to...
Yeah, I do. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, so there are going to be some sort of multimedia aspects to this presentation. So let me bring up.
Why would the mouse cars on fire?
There's going to be a film clip. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on.
MIA.
Yeah. No, it's not going to be. All right.
We're going to have Crossbear playing in the background?
No. Okay. So the usual ways of categorizing various trends on the left today have become less useful for distinguishing politically and indicating potential future developments. Trends have defied historical or expected trajectories, if these in fact ever applied properly, and so call for a new and different approach to sort out what we're dealing with today and are likely to encounter going forward. Other categories with which the left is usually divided, that I'm going to list in a moment, Platypus has been rightly recognized, if only occasionally and intermittently, for traversing, if not transcending, these categories in terms of the divisions of the left in the approach of our project. The first of these sets of distinctions would be socialist versus liberal, right? That kind of conception of the socialist left versus the liberal left. Supposedly, that distinction, those categories, are rooted in a class perspective, as in bourgeois liberal and proletarian socialist, but not necessarily class character in terms of sociological position, but rather in Marx's own sense, for instance, of the petty bourgeois horizon for politics, that thus aligns intellectuals with the petite bourgeoisie, not literally because they're members of the petite bourgeoisie, but because they share a kind of social historical horizon and outlook. But this distinction between socialist and liberal is also perhaps expressive of the antinomy of individual versus collective freedom, certainly in ways that we would not resolve as apparently simply as historical Marxism has done. For instance, characterizing the right as prioritizing liberty, while the left supposedly prioritizes social justice. That's the first sort of set of categories, socialist and liberal. The second would be libertarian versus authoritarian. This characterization that is sort of, in a sense, a kind of anarchistic division. This is a way of supposing the distinction between Marxism and anarchism, for example. And this is less about sociological position than political practice and the concomitant organizational methods associated with politics. So, for instance, in the libertarian versus authoritarian framework, you have horizontal versus hierarchical and decentralized versus centralized political practices and methodologies. So that's the second. First, socialist versus liberal. Second is libertarian versus authoritarian. Now the third will start to hit a little bit closer to home, especially with respect to the panel that we had last night. And that's anti-Stalinist versus Stalinist. And this is a supposedly Trotskyist perspective, and perhaps the most problematic for our purposes, considering the sort of major organization that we have to contend with in the United States, but also a similar organization in Britain, namely the ISO and the SWP Britain. This distinction between anti-Stalinist and Stalinist left is not reducible to the libertarian versus authoritarian division, although it's apparently related to it. At an earlier and relatively less degenerate historical stage of the left than today, this would have been rather characterized not as libertarian versus authoritarian, but rather internationalist versus nationalist. In other words, a sort of anti-Stalinist perspective would have been seen as internationalism, and a Stalinist perspective would have been seen as nationalism. But that sort of core distinction of Trotskyism and Trotskyism's critique of Stalinism has really been effaced and lost in the recent period. Because Platypus is in fact concerned with overcoming what are today inaccurate characterizations of the problems facing emancipatory perspectives moving forward, we must externally and publicly problematize, but also internally not use unproblematically such categories. In other words, it's not really for us, either in our public work nor internally in our own thinking, for us to simply use these distinctions. Neither socialist versus liberal, that's really not a category that we can use the way Marxists in the past have, nor libertarian versus authoritarian, nor anti-Stalinist and Stalinist. Like, these are categories that really won't do for us, neither in terms of our own thinking nor in terms of our public work. And the problem with these categories is historical, but specifically in terms of our own sort of practice, the problem is that these are largely unthinking categories on the left. In other words, these are categories that the left uses as a feature of it being dead, namely it being not able to think. That's why we can't use them. Rather, the set of categories that I'd like to introduce for our consideration today and moving forward that we need to confront, which apply both clearly to the present, but also to what might appear to be a rather obscure history stemming from the earliest manifestations of Stalinism in the 1920s and early 30s, is that of the anti-fascist or anti-imperialist left. We have, in large measure, the history of the German left since the 1960s, in fact, to thank for these categories, namely anti-Fa and anti-Imp. Which, however, have a much greater international and historical significance than may at first appear to be the case. Indeed, we need to confront these categories as the true manifestations of the real controversies besetting the left today, and for deep historical reasons. Of course, for many, the distinction between fascism and imperialism is a distinction without a difference. Fascists are imperialist, and imperialists are fascistic, right? But this is only at the most superficial and pejorative meaning of these categories. What they refer to, rather, analytically and politically, are quite different kinds of problems. So it becomes a matter of how one prioritizes the concerns of one's politics. Are one's concerns primarily anti-imperialist, or are they anti-fascist? And this is where I'm going to use my first aid, if you will. Yes. In Tariq Ali's book, Trotsky for Beginners, there is a passage on this page in particular, 143, on the right, in which the Stalinist characterization of Trotsky as a fascist is ridiculed in light of the need for a united anti-fascist political struggle by the communists and the social democrats and others against the Nazis in Germany. But Ali's Trotskyist common sense should not be taken at face value. Rather, one needs to understand why the Stalinists, that is, the vast majority of communists, internationally at the time, would have found this characterization of Trotsky's perspective as fascist plausible. In other words, why was it that the Trotskyite fascist wreckers, like why did the majority of communists believe that? So I would like to sort of look at this first and then talk about it a little bit more in detail. So this is a page spread from Tariq Ali's Trotsky for Beginners. Right? So according to Tariq Ali, Trotsky remains faithful to the United Front strategy as accepted in 1922 by the Comintern. In this spirit, he appeals to Germans, to German communists, to unite with social democrats against Nazism. Worker communists, you are hundreds of thousands, millions, you cannot leave. What happened? Sorry. It's weird. Hold on. Computer's on. Did I loosen the cable?
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Thanks.
Good shot.
Worker communists, you are hundreds of thousands, millions. You cannot leave for any place. There are not enough passports for you. Should fascism come to power, it will ride over your skulls and spines like a tank. And only a fighting unity with social democratic workers can bring victory. Make haste, you have very little time left. Then the Stalinist reply on the right. Nothing could be as detrimental to the German working class and communism, and nothing would promote fascism so much as the realization of so criminal a proposal, that is, socialist-communist unity. He who proposes such a bloc only assists the social fascists. His role is indeed plainly fascist. Okay, so what we have to, confront plainly is, why one perspective was like less than 1% of communists in the world, some fraction of 1%, and why the other perspective was, 99 and more percent of the communists. And what I would argue is that we should not assume that Trotsky was right and the Stalinists were wrong. However tempting this may be in retrospect. In other words, because the Nazis came to power, it would appear to be the case that Trotsky had this prophetic warning, right? He was proven right negatively, like that kind of idea. The Stalinists thought that Trotsky's perspective would have meant strengthening, that is, caving into the Social Democrats, who in turn would not have scrupled to unleash the fascists against the communists if they got to be too threatening, as indeed had happened in the 1918-1919 German Revolution and Civil War. And also during the Russian Civil War. We shouldn't neglect the role that the Mensheviks and other socialists, other non-Bolshevik Marxists played in the Russian Civil War, where they helped the whites. Trotsky's perspective was rather that the communists could indeed get the upper hand on the Social Democrats and lead and split them in a united front against the fascists. In other words, the united front as a tactic or as a strategy, that you unite with the Social Democrats to defeat the Nazis, and in so doing you show the efficacy of communist leadership. You show that the communists are in fact the real anti-fascist fighters. Perhaps this could have worked. But this is precisely what the ISO and others think can happen today in making common cause with the Islamists against the imperialists, or what Trotskyists earlier thought could happen in drawing close to the Stalinists in the post-World War II period. I'm thinking of the Pavlovites or the Mandelites. In many respects, this is an insoluble problem. and a key reason why tactical or even strategic judgments made by Marxists in earlier eras should not be hypostasized as abstract, timeless principles. Trotsky's position was the more optimistic, and indeed for our purposes the more interesting position in the dispute, but not some unalloyed truth that we can simply reckon today. The other side of the anti-imperialist, anti-fascist divide also comes from this period of Stalinism in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That is, this is the more difficult question. In other words, this question, why didn't the communists unite with the Social Democrats to stop the fascists? There's actually an even worse question we have to confront, which is why did the communists make common cause, in fact, at times, with the Nazis? Because they did. They participated in common demonstrations and protests with Nazis, in fact, in the late 1920s. And they did so specifically in protesting against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, but the terms of the Treaty of Versailles with respect to reparations, and also the occupation of parts of Germany, for instance, by French African troops, which was, you can imagine, for the Nazis, a point of major controversy. And in fact, the children, the offspring of these African soldiers and German women, were the first people that the Nazis took away to be killed when they came to power. The Nazis had their own brand of anti-imperialism, with which the communists thought that they could make common cause. In other words, both the Nazis and the communists characterized the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations forced on Germany after World War I, and the occupation of Germany by French troops as imperialist. And so in that respect, the communists were like, yeah, it's imperialist, absolutely. And the Nazis were like, yes, this is imperialist. And of course, they meant something different by the term imperialism, much as, Hezbollah would mean something quite different from the ISO or the SWP Britain on the term imperialism. Nevertheless, this becomes a kind of common cause. Now I'm going to show a video clip. This is like pure demagogy, but I couldn't help myself. This is a great video clip, though. Any of you who know this film? This is Kiss of the Spider Woman. Yes. So this will be about a 2-minute clip that you should watch.
You should watch the entire movie at some point.
Yeah, you should watch everyone should watch the entire movie, and Platypus will show it every year from now on.
Would you like some more speeches?
No, thanks, I'm stuffed. Good food, good cigarette. I don't remember when I felt so good. There's only one thing missing.
Christ! And I thought I was supposed to be the one who was a degenerate around here.
No, I mean a good movie.
Of course. Sis, why didn't I think of that?
Your Nazi movie, how does it end?
I mean, I thought you hated it.
Yeah, but I'm curious to see how it turns out.
Well, let's see.
They are dining at the majestic table in Werner's chateau. As Werner begins to notice Lenny's cold distance, she suddenly, impulsively, hurls her wine glass across the room and says,
I refuse to love a man who is the butcher of my country.
Oh, my love. Come with me, and you will understand.
Werner takes her to this government archive filled with photos and documents about famine throughout the world. He shows her how the elite create false shortages to enslave the masses. deeply moved and begins to see things through Werner's eyes. From that moment on, Lenny understood Werner's mission to liberate humanity from injustice and domination. As they leave the Baroque archive, Lenny feels the anguish in her heart being transformed back to her previous admiration, but this time with the depth of a love reborn.
Oh, my love, how could I ever have doubted you?
She begs him to forgive her and promises to help ensnare his enemies. She arranges this secret meeting with the head of the resistance by telling him that she will give the map, remember the map? Only to him.
Sorry, I had to let it go until the little music. The music part is just priceless. It's priceless. Because really the scene was already over. But I like the making sinister of the Marseillaise. So, right. The Nazis were fighting against oppression and injustice in the world. They certainly were, in their own mind. And we'd be remiss to ignore that fact, that they thought of themselves that way. Did I lose my connection again?
No, it was on.
It was on for a second.
One more time.
Anyway, we might do without this. Although I do have one more teacher's aid to give. Oh, good, we're good. All right, good. Right. Now, such anti-imperialism should remind us of the ISO and the SWP Britain with respect to Hezbollah, Hamas, and even Al-Qaeda. Tariq Ali, the editor of Verso Books, after all, did publish the collected writings of Osama bin Laden, which I, always tell people about, and they think that I've made it up. But, it's Verso, man. And you should also see. Notable for its scope and comprehensiveness, this collection of 24 newly translated public statements offers a nuanced and revealing view of public enemy number one. Right. So anyway, yes, a comprehensive and unexpurgated explanation of the man behind radical Islam. Yes. So it's tantalizing for us to get back to the sort of main point about Trotsky and the history. It's tantalizing for us to sympathize with Trotsky's position as the path not taken. So I'll bring back. It's gone. Even if Trotsky's approach to fighting fascism had prevailed, it would have presented new problems. In other words, because Trotsky's is the path not taken, we can kind of say, okay, the tragedy was that nobody listened to Trotsky, etc. But if in fact, a united front of communists and fascists, communists and social democrats, had taken place, it would have presented new political problems, and so it's hard to say how that history would have played out. The point is that it didn't, and so we can only learn from it so much. We cannot afford to short-circuit the question of political judgment and turn the matter into one of abstract principles, quickly devolving into a moral or ethical stance. Because after all, the ethical stance that would result would be unite and fight against the right. And we're very familiar with that as a kind of common concept on the left that comes from a later period, namely after the Nazis had already taken power, the Popular Front, in other words, the other side of fascism. For who is the right, essentially? In other words, who is the more dangerous right? In some respects, this seems rather straightforward. The Nazis were, of course, the more dangerous right than the Social Democrats, who were the less dangerous version of the right. But is this really true in terms of the actual concretely practical political situation at the time? Certainly the German and Russian counter-revolutionary civil wars, among other examples, demonstrated the vicious character of social democracy as a right-wing force. And we might say that the degree to which this played out later, that the degree to which Stalinism itself occupied the position of social democracy in many contexts after World War II, it also played a repressive role on the left. Now, look, we in Platypus are clearly more sympathetic to the anti-fascist left than we are to the anti-imperialist left. There's no getting around that. This can be found in our orientations towards groups such as the anti-Deutsch and others as our preferred objects of critique, more interesting for us in certain respects as objects of critical engagement, to be redeemed in some way. But we should not naturalize this, but rather recognize how the current situation came about historically. For the worst offenders of the anti-imperialist left today actually have roots in the anti-fascist left in a preceding era. In other words, today's divisions would not have applied in the past. And since I'm harping on the Cliffites, on the ISO and the SWP Britain, I would point out that they started out as a more anti-fascist than anti-imperialist left organizational tendency. For instance, really historically, they would have prioritized anti-Stalinism over anti-imperialism. This would have been the case up until fairly recently. Indeed, perhaps one could say all the way up to the collapse of Stalinism in 1989. So in regard to today's anti-fascist left, and of course it's controversial to characterize these guys as left, but I would. They're as much to the left as anyone else. People like Christopher Hitchens and Kanan Makia and others who are former Cliffites. That's where they come from politically. They, in other words, stayed true to anti-fascism and sort of experienced the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist divide as leaving them kind of stranded high and dry. But in regarding these kinds of figures, we should recognize that the critique, for instance, of Baathism in Iraq, like that's the sort of issue that we have concretely before us, and characterizing Baathism as fascist is certainly not enough to resolve the problem of U.S. imperialism. In other words, like a Hitchens or a Makia basically are like, well, the Baathists are fascists and so they're more dangerous, and so we'll kind of deal with U.S. imperialism as the lesser of two evils. But we really can't sort of accept that resolution of the problem. Another example, besides the Cliffites, is a more apparently exotic engagement that we're pursuing, but one that can also fit within this framework, and that's namely the RCP. The Maoists, or one strand of Maoism in the United States, the RCP USA, because they, for example, not very self-consciously and not uncontradictorily, but if you sort of track them in the period from the 80s up to the present, they've come to prioritize an anti-fascist perspective over an anti-imperialist perspective. In other words, what you'd find now is that they're not willing to simply have anti-imperialism be their guiding star. But there are serious problems with the anti-fascist, as I was saying, the anti-fascist left as well as the anti-imperialist left. So it is important for us to be aware of this divide so that we can properly discern it in its entirely symptomatic character. We cannot, in our own project, for many reasons, but even in terms of our own self-understanding, certainly not in our practice, we cannot afford to be either anti-fa or anti-imp in prioritizing our approach to the problems of the left. In other words, we ourselves have to resist falling into this division on the left. And instead, we have to heighten the awareness of it. So, questions? Richard.
A few comments. One is you spoke about, in the previous talk, Spencer was talking about the opacity of the 20th century. And I think that you could say that a lot of the early divisions you isolated, like socialism versus liberalism, was a 19th century problem. Trotsky, Stalinism and anti-Stalinism in the high 20th century, and the anti-Fa, anti-Imp problem is really a 21st century one, particularly. But I think
it's a post-60s one, post-60s.
But it's one that's particularly been exacerbated
by the collapse of Stalinism.
By the collapse of Stalinism, particularly since September 11. And I think that perhaps the more relevant moment in terms of the intellectual evolution of that conflict is not the social democratic, the question of the United Front, but rather World War II. Because World War II is the moment at which, like, the struggle against fascism requires, or seems to require to most leftists, although the Trotskys struggled with this issue, a support for imperialism in a very direct way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's perhaps like...
It's tricky though. I mean, what I'd say is the reason that I wouldn't actually allow it to be resolved that way in my own thinking and what I want you guys to consider is that certainly that's how Hitchens kind of rationalizes his position. Right, Hitchens basically says, look, the left supported the Allies in World War II, and so we ought to, bracket the question of imperialism with respect to fascism. I would say that, the support for the Allies in World War II by the left was greatly facilitated by the Soviet Union being on the side of the Allies.
Well, absolutely it was, but it wasn't...
Without that wouldn't have happened.
Well, right, but the point is that it did happen. And I think the other issue that has to be brought up is when people speak of anti-fascism, I mean, the anti-fascism that, particularly in the anti-imperialist context, is being discussed is, quote, fascism in the third world. Right. And I think that it's that the impulse between it's how one conceives of the problem of...
If you asked Hitchens, though, right, what would he say? He would say the U.S. supported the fascists against the Soviet Union, right? In other words, in Afghanistan, right? And so in that respect, there would have been this idea that imperialism is complicit with third world fascism.
Right, and that was particularly the line during the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that now you have conflicts that...
Well, you have a pseudo-anti-imperialism. Right, and that's why I showed the clip from Kiss of the Sweater Woman, because the Nazis were anti-imperialist. They thought every race in the world should have its own brand of fascism and just duke it out in the Götterdämmerung. And whoever came out on top, that's just the way, that's just, beyond good and evil or something. Watson.
I'd like to raise the question of the effectiveness of anti-fascism in the World War II period. In two ways. First is that in the Netherlands, you have interesting divisions on the left that persist after the fall of the Netherlands in fall 1940 to the point where there are 5 different resistance groups, one of which liquidates itself by writing an open letter protesting the invasion. That's the communist left. But the other leftist groups were unable to work together. The Communist Party, they all signed on with their names and addresses. And the second question is, of course, after the war in West Germany, denazification never really happened, in the sense that it remained a political question that the new left was able to seize upon, and indeed a lot of the sympathy, if not outright support, for some of the more radical excesses of the 60s who left in Germany came from a popular awareness that the roots of the post-war settlement in surviving institutions that had been inherently fascist had not been adequately worked through. So it's sort of a question of, when one's talking about anti-fascism, is that really having an anti-fascist result, or is it simply creating a slightly less authoritarian state that retains the same kind of structure as a fascist state, even if it's not explicitly politically fascist? Right.
Well, you're talking basically about the post-war settlement, and were the Allies really anti-fascist, right? Right. That's a good question. That's why, in a sense, I skirted World War II very deliberately, because I feel like it confounds a lot of issues, And specifically, I think that it can be used as a kind of an evasion of the kind of problem that I'm trying to present. Denazification is tricky because, the East had its denazification, but also it was partial in its own ways, right? It's not as if the East was more, really denazified, really, at a qualitative level, maybe quantitatively. The whole question of complicity with fascism, really, notice though that the question of imperialism hovers in the background there, right? Because I think that what we're talking about also, the difference between now and then, is inter-imperialism, meaning World War I, World War II are characterized by inter-imperialist conflict in a way that the present world is not. Thankfully so. In other words, we should be thankful that that's the case. And so it changes the whole character of the concept of imperialism, which is another reason why I skirted the question. In other words, I really looked at it as a matter of fascism as a new phenomenon. It's a post-World War I phenomenon. It's a new phenomenon that the Marxist left did not do a great job dealing with. The conception of imperialism also kind of underwent a transformation as a result of the post-World War I situation and the way the Comintern sort of thought about decolonization. There was a transformation, so you have a new phenomenon, fascism, and you have a transformation in the way that imperialism is regarded with respect to the colonized world. Because really in the Second International period, the problem of imperialism would not have been thought of in terms of core periphery, but would have been thought of in terms of inter-imperialism. I think Ben Shepard. And then
One of the interesting thing about the divide that you sketch out between anti-imperialist and anti-fascist left is that it's sort of on both sides, the leftness, so to speak, or the unity of their positions is not recognized. So one thing that's sort of been a problem for us is that we invited Kahimakia to speak, and this has actually been a reason for boycott, because like a group like the ISO, for example, thinks that because we've invited Kahimakia, that means we've transgressed some sort of line.
But you realize that they offered a speaker of their own to debate Kahimakia,
yeah, of course.
Ashley Smith.
I don't want to put too much.
Right.
It's just an example sort of how the divide may be recognized, but it's not, or it may be felt as like a hostility on both sides. And someone like Hitchens, I don't know if he would really see the ISOs as comrade, not practically. No,
of course not, absolutely. He would say they're like the worst of the worst or something.
What it sort of seems is like that you're proposing that our work is to bring this divide to consciousness as something that's not actually about political past, but it's about an undigested history. So what is it? What would it take for us as a group to do this, to have a transformative effect on this question?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're going to have to navigate, because we do have this project of expanding into Germany. And so we have to navigate the German left. And, my sense is, if I come at it myself, looking at it from a sort of traditional polemical kind of political perspective, which isn't quite appropriate to what Platypus is doing, and therefore it doesn't really apply too easily. But of course it comes down to, okay, what kind of intervention do we need to make in Germany? And, I just feel like it's Lenin, all the way, Lenin. It's just Lenin to the nth degree. Lenin and Trotsky, it's the Russians.
Can you talk about what that
means?
Can you just talk? What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, that the left that is our natural kind of interlocutor or starting point in Germany is not Die Linke, right? Is not the former communists. But is rather the other left, not the anti-imperialist left, but the anti-fascist left. And of course the anti-Deutsch are only part of that. And as such, they're either not really very Marxist, or if they're Marxist, they think of themselves as Luxemburgist or something like that. And, of course Luxemburg herself was a Russian. That's the other part that's absurd to the whole thing, is this German-Russian divide. And, she's from the Russian Empire. And, she was as much a Russian as Trotsky was, or even Lenin for that matter. Do you know this craziness? That someone has done some research to prove that Lenin had Jewish ancestry, that he was really Jewish? Yeah, right. So in terms of the intervention that we need to make, it's really about busting up this perspective. In other words, that Lenin and Trotsky are about imperialism. Leninism and Trotskyism are about the problem of imperialism. Luxemburg as a libertarian is more about the problem of fascism and authoritarianism, etc. And so we really need to just break that up very profoundly, otherwise we won't make any headway whatsoever. Jeremy?
I mean, I'm sort of wondering, I guess talking about the Germany, it makes a little more sense to me why this was the focus. But it seems to me that, I mean, in some ways, if we're thinking about the American left at the current moment, right, I mean, it's sort of like these two categories, the anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, to some extent were more like, you know, 5 years ago, like that the Obama age is much more in some ways characterized, again, by this like resurgent question of like liberalism, socialism, I mean, the Arab Spring, et cetera. Like, I'm kind of wondering why these categories now, because it seems like actually sort of what is politicizing people, et cetera, is precisely like, you know, and you can tell this by, yeah, what is politicizing people is not the question of like imperialism or anti-imperialism at the moment.
But it's still there. Like in other words, with respect to Egypt and Libya, right? In other words, Egypt and Libya, we have to recognize, has thrown the left for a loop. I mean, it's true the left is especially sort of quiescent right now. In other words, in comparison to the anti-war left that we were dealing with, which was a sort of spurious reanimation of the dead left. That's the zombie left. Like now, we're not really dealing with too much zombie leftism, or very little zombie leftism. And the degree to which we are, though, it's thrown them for a loop. We shouldn't fool ourselves. Libya especially is disorienting for people, but Egypt as well. In other words, Egypt, the idea was Mubarak was pro-US, and therefore we can be with the people against Mubarak because you know, it would be sort of anti-imperialist in some way to be on the side of the people against a US-supported dictator. And so it sort of resolved a little bit too neatly. In other words, when people sort of scratch the surface and think about it. And again, I have the Cliffites in mind, right? Because the SWP Britain has comrades in Egypt. There is an Egyptian Marxist group that has made, you know, the argument that essentially you could have a united front and split orientation towards the Muslim Brotherhood, right? That essentially, you know, that you have to see that the Muslim Brotherhood is not monolithic and young people and this kind of thing. And it's because that their organization in Egypt has this perspective of working, you know, that they have like a long-standing, in fact, relationship with the fringes of the Muslim Brotherhood that they're hoping to capitalize on now in the context of the collapse of the Mubarak regime. And so, you know, like for instance, right, you know, what if overthrowing Mubarak were to mean that Egypt would become even more pro-Israeli? Do you think the left would be very enthusiastic about that revolution? Right, if that were clearly the case, right, there would not have been this kind of enthusiasm. And, you know, and so it replays itself with Libya in a kind of more degenerate form because the situation is so much more wretched. Pam?
I just wanted, just piggybacking off of Jeremy's and maybe thinking about the event that we just had in New York at the New School with the RCP. So the RCP's title for the event was like, against U.S. imperialism. It was like U.S. imperialism or like fundamentalism, right? Like both deadly. Is there another way? Mm-hmm. Right, which shows the kind of anti-fascist, you know, kind of tendencies at work. However, in the panel, Sarah Taylor, who was the speaker for the RCP, you know, responding to Laura's comments, Laura sort of raising the problem of the left in a kind of incoherent way in which one sort of thinks about one's own politics in the present. She responded to Laura by saying, well, of course we know what the left is, or we know what it means to be a leftist today. I mean, obviously she's saying, like, we are leftists, right? But she added a point. She said, of course we know what it means to define oneself as a leftist is as an anti-imperialist.
Right.
And so that there's a kind of incoherence at work, even in trying to articulate, at least from the RCP's perspective, in what way, you know, like the anti-fascist sort of...
I'm not saying that people are going to accept this.
Yeah, let me just, I mean, one thing, because I think that Laura, in her talk, I mean, like, Laura had... Where's Laura? Over here. Okay, I mean, we were like kind of digesting the comments that she'd made, and one of the comments that she made was about Laura came into the event thinking that people were going to sort of talk about the relationship between the left and liberalism, especially in the case of Egypt. And she kind of realized that because of Libya, she sort of raises in her talk, that because of Libya, the left then, instead of raising the problem of the relationship between the left and liberalism, it then went back into categories of anti-imperialism. And so that, you know, protesting against, you know, potential interventions, or the interventions in Libya by the United States, like just kind of obfuscated the problem once again, even though there was something kind of made available by.
I mean, look, we have to struggle against something, which is we were formed in really the experience of the anti-war movement, and therefore the critique of the anti-war movement. So what we're going to be carrying around with us from our formative moment is permanent nostalgia for the kind of clarity about the left that gave us. And I think that the fascist question is much more difficult. I think that the RCP tries to compensate for what I would say is their prioritization of anti-fascism over anti-imperialism with this kind of rhetoric, and also other things like some crazy statement that I got in my inbox about imagine a world without the United States, that would be socialism. Like it was like that kind of idea, and I'm like, no, it would just be fascism. But yeah, the anti-Deutsch has rubbed off on me. Then
I wanted to get you to speak to, some of maybe the genealogy of Platypus to a certain extent. And you've kind of already indicated, and I think it's part of Jeremy's question as well. But the way in which Platypus kind of Ben invoked the figure of Platypus as the kind of psychotherapist of the left. The way that really occurs, right, is that we provoke a sort of response from the left in regards to our project. So at one moment, we were known on the left as the neocons. Right. And of course, what do you mean by that? Right. And then another moment now, our moment in a sense, or maybe it's already dissipating, but our moment now is much more characterized by the response to us as you're ultra-leftist. Yeah, just very. So we say, what do we mean by that? And I wondered if you could kind of like map or overlay that set of responses onto this question of the anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, as also a way of registering the kind of historical changes over our own history. Right. Like I think that if we had taken off the way we wanted to right away, our first event would have been Tariq Ali, Christopher Hitchens, Kanan Makia, Fred Halliday, and me, right? Just saying, little old platypus, like, what about this, right? But that would have been our first event, right? If we could have done that, we would have done that. Which would have basically fulfilled our mandate as an organization, meaning we're the only organization that would have tried to have had that happen, right? And therefore we would have shown our necessity. Because in fact, the point is that again, there's at least as much of a problem with Christopher Hitchens as there is with Tariq Ali. I mean, it shouldn't even be necessary to say that, but it is, because of our own sort of, counter-identifications that we fall subject to, or Fred Halliday for that matter. In other words, Christopher Hitchens is just this kind of a blowhard, but like a Fred Halliday, who has a more considered position, right? Who basically took anti-fascism to the logical conclusion of anti-communism, meaning, Marx and Lenin are also like authoritarian, right? Richard.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to go back to Jeremy's question, because I think the question of genealogy, it seems to me that the distinction you outline of the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist actually obscures and is a reflection of the inability to deal with the two earlier distinctions you mentioned, namely of Stalinism and anti-Stalinism, and the even deeper one of liberalism and socialism. And for example, in the case of like the RCP, and they're neither Islamism nor the US, what that of course reminds me of is like the 1950s style third campism, like neither the Soviet Union nor the US. But it's an indirect reflection of it, and I think that many of the problems that you see in terms of thinking
because we started so late.
Well, anyway, so I think I'd like you to talk about how you see the problem of anti-fascism and anti-imperialism as tied to the problem of Stalinism, anti-Stalinism, and the ways, say, an organization like the ISO can have Stalinist characteristics that's anti-Stalinist, and the way that's tied into the confusion about socialism and liberalism.
Right. The reason that I'm, obviously we have to deal with the left as it symptomatically it is today, right? And so there's a way in which we would, of course, say, right, although publicly it would make no sense, but in terms of our own internal self-understanding, we would say that the ISO, the RCP, these kinds of groups are liberal. They're not even social democratic, they're liberal in a certain sense.
But they're also Stalinist.
Right. But the point of the matter is that in the 1930s, liberals, like the Soviet Union, liberals were pro-Stalinist in the Popular Front era, so that's no mystery. In other words, that's nothing new. The liberals only dropped Stalinism with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, right? Which was an anti-imperialist pact. Right, that was the idea. The idea was the imperialists are not going to protect the Soviet Union against the Nazis, so the Soviet Union has to make a non-aggression pact with the Nazis against the perfidy of the imperialists. So, we would basically say, the RCP has an essentially liberal position. In other words, if you looked at the posters on the wall that they had when they did their workshop here at our convention, it was like, look at how fascist the prison system is, right? And, that's essentially a liberal complaint about the prison system, which is fine, right? So when we say, okay, these groups are not even, in a sense, some kind of centrist or kind of social democratic, they don't fit on the political spectrum, but they're just liberal. In a sense, we wish that they were just liberal, because they're not even liberal, right? That's the other thing. In other words, when we say the left is dead, we mean the whole left. That's the other thing that you guys have to really grasp. We mean liberalism is dead, right? And so it's even, it's kind of a shorthand to say, oh, they're really liberal, right? Because the Spartacists would say something like that. They would say, the RCP and the ISO, what they are is shills for the Democrats, right? Which is kind of like, again, like, you would not get, people on the left to complain more about Obama than the RCP and the ISO. They complain a great deal about Obama. And so it's hard to make the case that what they really are left tails on the Democrats. But when the Spartacists call them left tails on the Democrats, they are assuming a great deal about both their objects of critique and the Democrats and social reality in a way that we cannot, right? In other words, it's unclear that the Democrats are to the left of the Republicans. That's the point, right? In any kind of historical sense. In other words, that there really is liberalism, and that you have like a kind of spectrum of liberalism where the Democrats are on the left and the Republicans are on the right. That's very unclear. That would be the point. And the whole issue of neoconism, I think it came up. One of our points with respect to neoconservatism is that neoconservatism and neoliberalism, it's why Jeffrey Sachs is one of the more major sort of liberal people running around with respect to various causes. They are the bastard children of the death of the left. Like they're the disintegrated parts of the left as much as any of the sectarian Marxist groups are. And so in that respect, the reason it's a deeper problem is that we're not even dealing with liberalism. In other words, we're not dealing with the inadequacy of liberalism, right? I think that, Richard, what you brought up was the 19th century problem of Marxism, which is that Marxism was meant to pick up from liberalism and carry forward what liberalism, what bourgeois society had dropped. In other words, in bourgeois society becoming illiberal, dropping its liberalism, and being liberal only in the most sort of, superficial way, that Marxism was meant to sort of fulfill the desiderata of liberalism, and in a sense that's the nature of our return.
If only we were there.
If only we were there, right? Because the thing is that regression it's not linear. It doesn't bring us back to some point, right? Where really what we're talking about is the inadequacy of liberalism, right? We're not dealing with John Stuart Mills, right? There are no John Stuart Mill, like a vulgar bourgeois thinker, according to Marx. There's no one like that today. That doesn't exist. Right? We're not dealing with like Ersatz John Stuart Mills. We're dealing with something a lot more creepy. We're dealing with softcore authoritarianism or post-fascist society. That's what we're dealing with. I mean, that's where, in a sense, the Frankfurt School comes back in, right? In other words, we're living in a society that's not liberal so much as a society that doesn't need to repress people very much to keep going, right? Which is very different. And that's why the RCP is right. Like when they say the mass incarceration is fascism, of course they're right. It's just that posing it that way appears to present political tasks that are really not political tasks, but are rather moral outrages. Right? Saying, the mass incarceration of people is worse than slavery, of course that's true. Of course it's true. But it just doesn't lead anywhere politically. And so it's a problematic kind of ideological kind of self-deception on their part to kind of get histrionic. And to essentially, you know, I mean, basically another way of putting it is, you know, you've got to be a Maoist to be a liberal nowadays. Right? And, you know, think about that. Right? Because really, there we're getting to the heart of what Stalinism really represented, historically. And that's what it means to say that we're dealing with the undigested legacy of Stalinism. All right, I've got to wrap up because we have to move on to our internal meeting. Thanks.
We're going to have the internal meeting here. Can we meet back in 10 minutes? Like, we really have
Yeah, just a bathroom break.
Can I really quick see anyone in the New York van just up front over here?
I read books really quickly.
Just in 1 minute, but.